The morning mist clung to the volcanic ridges like a shroud as Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi stood on the deck of the carrier Akagi, watching mechanics service the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters lined in perfect symmetry along the flight deck. The air smelled of aviation fuel and salt spray. Somewhere in the distance, a wrench dropped against steel plating, the sound swallowed by the humid tropical silence. His officers had assured him the intelligence was sound. American carrier strength in the Pacific remained shattered, scattered, demoralized. Pearl Harbor had seen to that. The path across the ocean lay open, they said, like an unguarded road through conquered territory. But Nagumo, a cautious man by nature, felt the weight of something he could not name, a shadow at the edge of certainty, the kind that comes when victory arrives too easily and the enemy grows quiet not from defeat but from preparation. The Japanese Empire had spent months constructing what its strategists called the ribbon defense, a chain of fortified islands stretching across the Pacific like beads on an iron necklace. From the Marshalls to the Gilberts, from Wake to Rabaul, each atoll became a watchpost, each lagoon a staging ground. The doctrine was simple. Extend the perimeter so far that American forces would exhaust themselves crossing the vast blue emptiness, bleeding strength with every mile, until they arrived broken and desperate at Japan's doorstep. And at the center of this strategy lay a single precious assumption: they would see the Americans coming. Japanese reconnaissance doctrine in early 1942 reflected a military culture that prized thoroughness and ritual precision. Scout planes launched at dawn in coordinated patterns, their pilots trained to follow strict search grids, reporting with formulaic discipline. Sector clear, no enemy contact. The phrases repeated like liturgy, each negative report reinforcing the conviction that the Pacific had become a Japanese lake. Intelligence officers compiled these reports into neat charts, ink marks on maps that showed emptiness where the American fleet once prowled. And for months, the reports proved accurate. American carriers withdrew, retreated, vanished into the vastness between California and Hawaii. The ocean seemed to validate every assumption. What Nagumo and his staff did not know, what they could not know, was that emptiness can be a weapon sharper than steel. The German soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad would later describe their shock at American prisoner of war rations, white bread, canned meat, chocolate bars distributed with casual abundance. Japanese troops on Guadalcanal, starving in the jungle, would whisper in disbelief about marine supply dumps overflowing with food, medicine, ammunition stacked like firewood. But in those early months of 1942, the Japanese Navy lived in a different reality. They expected an American military hobbled by Depression-era scarcity, a democracy too soft for sustained sacrifice, a nation that would sue for peace after one sharp defeat. Pearl Harbor was supposed to be that defeat. Instead, American shipyards hummed with a sound Japan had never anticipated, the sound of industrial fury unleashed. While Japanese scouts reported empty seas, the United States was building carriers at a pace that defied logic. Essex-class hulls taking shape in Brooklyn, Newport News, Philadelphia. Factories that once produced automobiles now stamped out aircraft fuselages 24 hours a day. Women who had never held welding torches learned their craft in weeks and worked shifts that turned day into night into day again. The American economy, that vast sleeping giant, had awakened, not to negotiate, but to manufacture vengeance. But industrial capacity means nothing if your enemy cannot find you. And in the spring of 1942, the Americans had learned something the Japanese had not yet grasped. In the age of carrier warfare, invisibility was survival. The first crack in Japanese naval intelligence came not as a dramatic revelation, but as a troubling inconsistency. Scout planes reported an American carrier task force in the Coral Sea, moving to intercept the Port Moresby invasion convoy. The Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku raced to engage. The battle that followed was the first in naval history where opposing ships never sighted each other. A contest fought entirely by aircraft, a duel between flight decks separated by hundreds of miles of open water. When the smoke cleared, the Americans had lost the carrier Lexington, and the Japanese declared victory. But Admiral Inoue Shigeyoshi, commander of the Fourth Fleet, read the damage reports with growing unease. Shokaku had taken 3 bomb hits. Her flight deck was a wreckage of twisted steel. Zuikaku had lost so many aircraft and pilots that she could no longer operate effectively. The Port Moresby invasion had been turned back. Most troubling of all, the Americans had known exactly where to find the Japanese carriers. Their scout planes had arrived with uncanny precision, as if guided by something more than luck. The Americans had broken the Japanese naval codes, but in Tokyo, officers dismissed such suggestions as defeatist paranoia. Their codes were unbreakable, they insisted. Mathematics and honor guaranteed it. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort worked in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, a space his cryptanalysts called the Dungeon, a windowless concrete room that smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. Banks of IBM tabulating machines clattered night and day, processing intercepts from Japanese radio traffic. Rochefort's team had been attacking the Japanese Navy's JN-25 code since before the war, chipping away at its mathematical structure with a patience that bordered on obsession. By May 1942, they could read perhaps 15% of Japanese messages, not enough for complete clarity, but enough to glimpse intentions, to detect patterns in the noise. And in late May, those patterns began to converge on a single word that appeared again and again in Japanese communications: AF. The intercepts spoke of a coming operation, a decisive strike against target AF. Supply requisitions, fleet movements, Admiral Yamamoto himself would command. But where was AF? Rochefort's team debated possibilities. Australia, perhaps, or Hawaii again, or the Aleutians. Then Rochefort had an idea that bordered on theatrical cunning. He instructed Midway Island to send an unencrypted radio message reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. 2 days later, Japanese intercepts reported that AF was short of water. Rochefort brought his findings to Admiral Chester Nimitz with the certainty of a mathematician proving a theorem. The Japanese would strike Midway in early June with overwhelming force, 4 carriers, perhaps more. They expected surprise. They expected to draw out and destroy what remained of American carrier strength. They expected to find the Pacific empty of resistance. Nimitz, a man whose calm demeanor concealed a gambler's instinct, made a decision that would have been unthinkable by conventional doctrine. He would position his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway, beyond the range of Japanese scout planes. He would give the Japanese what they expected to see: an empty ocean. And then, when their carriers launched their strike against Midway, when their flight decks were cluttered with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, American dive bombers would fall from the sky like the fist of an angry god. The plan required perfect timing, perfect intelligence, and perfect faith that Rochefort's cryptanalysts had read the enemy's intentions correctly. One mistake, and the American carriers would be trapped and destroyed. Nimitz approved the operation. His carriers put to sea. Admiral Nagumo stood in the carrier's operations room, reviewing the morning's reconnaissance plan. 7 search planes would launch at first light, fanning out across 7 sectors in a pattern that had become routine, the same ritual performed 100 times before. His staff expected the searches to confirm what they already believed, that American forces remained concentrated at Pearl Harbor, that Midway would fall with minimal resistance, that the Pacific still belonged to Japan. But military ritual, no matter how precisely observed, cannot protect against what you do not know you should be looking for. The search planes launched into the pre-dawn darkness, their pilots following their assigned sectors with disciplined precision. One by one, they radioed back, "Sector clear, no enemy contact." The phrases arrived like a benediction, confirming expectations. In the operations room, officers marked their charts with satisfied confidence. The ocean was empty. The Americans were absent. Victory was certain. What those pilots did not know, what Nagumo's entire staff did not know, was that the American carriers were positioned in the one sector where mechanical failure had delayed a Japanese scout plane by 30 minutes. That half-hour delay meant the difference between detection and invisibility. By the time the scout plane finally covered its assigned sector, the American task force had moved beyond its search radius, slipping through the reconnaissance net like smoke through fingers. The sky, Nagumo believed, was empty of enemies. The reports said so. Mathematics said so. Doctrine said so. The sky was not empty. At 05:34 hours, Japanese strike aircraft launched from all 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, a formation of level bombers, dive bombers, and fighters numbering over 100 aircraft. They turned southeast toward Midway, their engines droning in the tropical morning, confident in their mission. Behind them, the carriers began the delicate process of recovering the returning scout planes and preparing a second wave. Flight decks became workshops of controlled chaos, mechanics hauling torpedoes, fuel hoses snaking across steel plating, ordnance crews exchanging land attack bombs for armor-piercing weapons, just in case American ships appeared. At 07:28 hours, one of the delayed scout planes sent a message that shattered the morning's certainty. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships. Nagumo's staff froze. Surface ships? Here? The intelligence had been wrong. 15 minutes later, the scout plane clarified, enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. A carrier. The Americans had a carrier within striking range, and Nagumo's flight decks were cluttered with aircraft being rearmed. His first strike was still attacking Midway. His fighters were dispersed. His ships were vulnerable. Nagumo faced an impossible choice: launch immediately with whatever aircraft were ready, or take the time to properly prepare a coordinated strike. Doctrine demanded the second option. Doctrine had always been reliable. He ordered his crews to complete the rearming process. Torpedoes were hauled back out. Bombs were stacked on the hangar decks. The flight decks became forests of ordnance and aviation fuel, waiting for the match. High above, beyond sight and hearing, American dive bombers were already in their approach. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 33 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, searching for the Japanese carriers with fuel gauges dropping toward the point of no return. His assigned intercept coordinates had been wrong. The Japanese fleet had changed course while his aircraft were in flight. Now he faced a decision that violated every rule of carrier operations: continue the search beyond safe fuel margins, or turn back and land with bombs still attached. McCluskey pushed forward, trusting instinct over procedure. At 10:20 hours, he saw it: the white wake of a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the main fleet. He followed that wake like a thread through a maze. At 10:22 hours, he saw them. 4 Japanese carriers in a rough box formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft, no fighters at altitude, no combat air patrol overhead. The carriers were naked, exposed, vulnerable in a way that happens only once in a war. McCluskey did not hesitate. He rolled into his dive from 14,000 feet, the ocean tilting vertical, the carrier Kaga growing in his bomb sight from a toy model into a vast expanse of wood and steel. Behind him, 32 more dive bombers followed in sequence, a waterfall of aircraft dropping from the sky, while the Japanese crews below looked up in horror, realizing too late that their scouts had reported an empty ocean when the enemy had been there all along. The first bomb struck Kaga amidships, penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the hangar among stacked ordnance. Secondary explosions bloomed like flowers made of fire. The second bomb hit near the bridge. A third struck aft. Within minutes, Kaga became a floating pyre, her crew evacuating ship, her magazines cooking off with explosions that could be heard across the water. Simultaneously, dive bombers from Yorktown fell upon Soryu, planting 3 bombs in rapid succession. Her aviation fuel ignited in a river of flame that swept from bow to stern. Men threw themselves into the sea to escape the inferno. Lieutenant Richard Best led his section against Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, the carrier that had launched the Pearl Harbor strike. His single bomb penetrated the flight deck near the amidships elevator, detonating among aircraft being fueled and armed. The blast touched off a catastrophic chain reaction. Fuel vapors ignited, torpedoes exploded. The hangar deck became a crematorium. Nagumo evacuated to a cruiser, watching his flagship die, unable to comprehend how the Americans had appeared from an ocean his scouts had declared empty. In approximately 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers had been transformed from instruments of conquest into burning wrecks. The 4th, Hiryu, would launch a desperate counterstrike before American dive bombers found her that afternoon and sent her to join her sisters. The ocean that had been empty was suddenly full of retribution. Japanese survivors pulled from the water would later describe not just the physical horror of burning flight decks and exploding magazines, but a deeper wound, the psychological shock of having been utterly surprised despite following every reconnaissance protocol. They had done everything correctly. Their scouts had searched. Their reports had been filed. Their procedures had been observed with ritual precision, and still, the Americans had appeared from nowhere, as if conjured from empty sky. What broke at Midway was not just 4 carriers, but the foundational assumption that underlay Japanese naval strategy, that they would always see the enemy first, always dictate the terms of engagement, always hold the initiative. The Americans had proven that industrial capacity combined with cryptoanalysis could render Japanese reconnaissance obsolete. From June 4, 1942 onward, every Japanese naval operation would carry the shadow of doubt. Every empty horizon would hide potential threat. Every negative scout report would be received with skepticism born of trauma. The Japanese had expected to face an enemy constrained by scarcity, limited by democratic softness, handicapped by industrial weakness. Instead, they discovered an opponent who could hide carriers in plain sight, who could read their most secret communications, who could manufacture ships and aircraft faster than Japan could sink them. The abundance they encountered was not just material, but intellectual. An abundance of innovation, adaptation, willingness to break doctrine when doctrine failed. In the months following Midway, American carrier operations developed a pattern that Japanese commanders found increasingly demoralizing. American task forces would appear without warning, strike with overwhelming force, and vanish before Japanese reinforcements could arrive. The ocean, which geography suggested should favor Japanese interior lines, instead became an American hunting ground. Japanese garrisons on scattered islands would wake to find the horizon filled with American ships that, according to all intelligence reports, should not be within 1,000 miles. At Guadalcanal, Japanese pilots returning from strikes against Henderson Field reported American supply ships unloading with mechanical efficiency. Crates of ammunition stacked on beaches, fuel drums rolled ashore by the hundreds, food supplies sufficient to feed an army. Captured Japanese diaries from the campaign record a repeated theme of disbelief. How could the Americans transport such abundance across such distance? Where were the supply shortages, the logistical breakdowns, the vulnerabilities that Japanese planning had assumed must exist? The answer lay in an industrial capacity that Japan's pre-war strategists had fundamentally miscalculated. American shipyards launched more tonnage in 1943 than Japan had built in the previous decade. American factories produced more aircraft in single months than Japanese industry could manufacture in a year. The wealth that Japanese propaganda had dismissed as capitalist decadence revealed itself as the sinew of total war, an economic engine that could simultaneously feed its civilian population, arm its military, and supply its allies across 2 oceans and 4 continents. But material abundance alone does not win wars. What Midway demonstrated was something more subtle and more devastating. The Americans had learned to weaponize information itself. The breaking of Japanese naval codes represented one of the great intelligence achievements of the war, but its true significance lay not in any single decrypted message, but in the cumulative advantage it provided. American commanders could allocate their limited forces with precision, positioning carriers where they would intercept enemy operations, avoiding battles they could not win, choosing engagements where surprise multiplied their strength. The Japanese, by contrast, operated increasingly in darkness, their own reconnaissance compromised by American fighters and their assumptions poisoned by Midway's lesson that negative reports meant nothing, that empty seas could hide entire fleets, that the Americans might be anywhere. This information asymmetry created a psychological burden that weighed on Japanese naval planning like an invisible anchor. Caution replaced audacity. Operations were postponed, reconsidered, scaled back. The offensive spirit that had driven the first 6 months of the war gradually calcified into defensive rigidity. By 1943, Japanese carriers rarely ventured from protected waters, their admirals unwilling to risk another Midway, their pilots increasingly green and inexperienced, while American aviators accumulated combat hours and tactical knowledge that no amount of training could replicate. The symbolic weight of Midway extended beyond tactical considerations into the realm of ideology. Japanese militarism had promised invincibility through superior spirit, that Japanese willpower, Japanese discipline, Japanese racial destiny would overcome any material disadvantage. Midway proved that mathematics mattered more than morale, that logistics trumped courage, that a democracy mobilized for war could outproduce and outthink an authoritarian empire. The emptiness Japanese scouts reported became a metaphor for the emptiness of their own ideology, a doctrine that promised certainty but delivered catastrophic surprise. Among the objects recovered from sunken Japanese carriers in post-war salvage operations were the reconnaissance logbooks, water-stained but still legible, recording the search patterns flown on the morning of June 4, 1942. Each entry followed proper format: sector number, time, weather conditions, result. No enemy contact appeared again and again, the characters brushed with the careful precision of officers who believed procedure would protect them from the unknown. The last entries, written as American dive bombers fell from the sky, trailed off mid-sentence, ink smudged by hurried hands that would never complete their reports. These logbooks stand as testament to a military culture that valued ritual observance over adaptive thinking, that trusted doctrine even when doctrine had been compromised by an enemy who refused to behave according to prediction. The Japanese scout who flew the delayed search pattern, the 30-minute mechanical delay that allowed American carriers to slip through the reconnaissance net, survived the battle. In his post-war interviews, he described not guilt, but bewilderment. He had followed his orders exactly, searched his assigned sector thoroughly, reported his findings accurately. How then had the Americans appeared from nowhere? What error had occurred? The answer he could never quite accept was that there had been no error, merely an opponent who understood that invisibility was a weapon and that the most dangerous fleet was the one you believed did not exist. The survivors of Akagi clung to debris in water turned golden by the setting sun, watching their carrier's bow rise vertical against the sky before sliding beneath the waves. The sound it made, a groan of steel stressed beyond endurance, a roar of trapped air escaping through shattered bulkheads, carried across the water like a dirge. Some men wept, others stared in silence. All understood they had witnessed not just the loss of ships, but the death of an assumption, that Japan's path across the Pacific would remain clear, that American strength would dissolve before Japanese spirit, that the scouts would always see the enemy coming. The ocean, so carefully searched and declared empty, contained multitudes. 3 American carriers, 100 dive bombers, the cryptanalysts who had broken the codes, the shipyard workers who repaired Yorktown in 72 hours when doctrine said 3 months was required, the strategists who understood that surprise could multiply force, the pilots who followed a destroyer's wake into legend, all invisible until the moment they chose to be seen. In the decades following the war, military historians would debate Midway's tactical details, Nagamo's decisions, McCluskey's navigation, the role of luck versus planning. But the battle's deepest lesson transcended tactics. It demonstrated that in modern warfare, information dominates firepower, that the side which sees clearly while remaining unseen holds an advantage that no amount of courage can overcome, that abundance matters not just in factories, but in imagination, the abundance to conceive new strategies, to discard failed assumptions, to transform emptiness from void into weapon. The Japanese scouts reported no fleet. They had followed their patterns, performed their duties, filed their reports, and they were catastrophically, irreparably wrong. Not through incompetence or cowardice, but because they faced an enemy who had learned to hide in plain sight, to weaponize the vastness they thought protected them, to turn the Pacific itself into an instrument of deception. The sky that erupted over Midway on June 4, 1942, carried a message written in falling bombs and burning carriers, that emptiness is sometimes the loudest warning, that silence can conceal thunder, that the most dangerous enemy is the one you believe you have already defeated. The Japanese Navy entered the battle expecting confirmation of their supremacy. They left having learned that the ocean recognizes no master, and that democracy, when provoked, possesses an abundance not just of materiel, but of adaptability, the wealth to learn from defeat, to innovate under pressure, to appear from nowhere when most needed. In the end, the reconnaissance reports were accurate within their limited scope. The seas they searched were indeed empty of the assumptions Japanese strategy required,
empty of American compliance with predicted behavior, empty of the certainty that had carried the Japanese Navy through 6 months of conquest. And from that emptiness came the dive bombers, the code breakers, the shipyard workers, the strategists, all the invisible elements of a nation mobilized not for ritual war, but for total industrial conflict. The scouts reported no fleet. They were wrong. But by the time they discovered their error, the sky was already full of wings, and the ocean burned with the wreckage of assumptions.